You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's conversation, we're going to talk about how businesses are grappling with AI risk. Joining me today is Dr. Andrew Jones, Principal Researcher at the Conference Board in our Governance and Sustainability Center. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks so much, Steve. Great to be back with you again.
Andrew, you've written a new report and it focuses on the S&P 500, so a little larger firms, but talk to us about the scope of what you looked at for AI disclosure, AI risk, and so forth. What does AI mean in this context?
Yeah, sure. Happy to, Steve. And yeah, the Governance and Sustainability Center at the Conference Board put out some new research recently and a brand new report on how, as you said, S&P 500 companies are describing AI-related risks in the risk factors section of their annual SEC filings. That's their Form 10K. And we've looked back over the last few years, starting in 2023 all the way up to 2025. So it's capturing the period where AI is quickly mainstreamed and been adopted by a lot of companies. And for those who don't know, the Form 10Ks and the risk factor section of it is a standardized, legally required disclosure meant to investors to material business risks. So a risk that a reasonable investor might consider important when making decisions. So looking at these risk disclosures can be a really valuable lens on how companies, how boards, how executives are thinking about risks, are thinking about what's material, thinking about what's ahead and how they're adapting their governance. And AI is obviously a really interesting area because of how quickly it's exploded in the last few years. It's quite a timely and quite an innovative study. No one else has really done this kind of work yet. And I think it only offers a window into how big companies are integrating AI into their frameworks, into their enterprise risk management frameworks, into their governance processes, and how it's becoming a key responsibility for both the C-suite and the board.
So this study looked at the S&P 500 companies and their disclosures, what they've written about it. And so the scope of AI is whatever it was for that company that they deem to be material, right?
That's right. It's a really good point that we talk about AI sometimes in this broad way. Obviously, under the umbrella of AI, of artificial intelligence, there's a lot of different technologies, different processes, different capabilities, right? Generative AI has obviously captured a lot of attention in the last few years, and some companies might have been disclosing about generative AI and those kind of models and what they mean, but also talk about other technologies too, such as machine learning, deep learning, computer vision, predictive analytics. There's a lot of technologies here that together, I guess, mark a new era of almost cognitive infrastructure where AI is being embedded across functions and products and decisions, and companies are grappling with what that means both internally for their workforce with operations, but also externally for their products, how they engage with their customers.
So basically, this isn't a laundry list of everything that they're doing in AI. This is essentially a disclosure, a legal disclosure, essentially, or a governance disclosure that informs investors and external parties what the risks are around their AI use. So it's not meant to be a catalog of anything. But tell us, what are the legal requirements for AI disclosure?
Obviously, we've looked at Form 10K filings, right? So this is a standardized, legally required annual report, and within that, companies are obliged, US public companies are obligated by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, to disclose their material risks. So these are risks that a reasonable investor would consider important when making investment decisions. So in other words, meaning it could significantly affect a company's financial performance, operations, or reputation. Different companies and different industries will obviously be disclosing different kinds of things there. There might be some commonalities, but every company has its own sort of, its own risk exposure, its own sort of material issues. And AI is obviously starting to bubble up into that conversation, whereas companies integrate AI, whether it's into their operations or among their workforce or even into their products, it's raising new questions about risk, I guess, in terms of risks, whether AI systems fail or whether they misinform or whether they perpetuate bias, and also the broader sort of sphere of risks, I guess, attached to AI relating to regulations and litigation and investment. So there's a long list of things here, right? There's a broad universe of risk, but companies are obligated to disclose what they think is a material risk. And I guess in looking at these disclosures, therefore, we can see a lot of things, right? Including, as you said, how companies perhaps are thinking about investor expectations, thinking about future legal exposure, thinking about how boards are approaching governance and oversight of AI. So it's one lens of many, but it is an important lens and an important window, I think, onto how companies are thinking about AI and not just thinking about the opportunities of AI, but also the risks that can potentially materialize from that.
Now, your report talks about the surge here in disclosures just since 23, 24, 25. Talk about the percentage of companies now disclosing some sort of material risk for AI, how that's changed. And then what does that mean about the rapid pace of AI adoption?
Yeah, it's a really interesting finding. So we found as recently as 2023, right? We're talking 2 years ago, the 2023 filing year, only 12% of the S&P 500 referred to AI at all in their risk, or had at least one material AI related risk disclosure. This year, it's 72%. That's a rapid increase in a very short space of time. I think it just sort of really illustrates and underscores how AI has so quickly shifted from being something that's new, something that's shiny, something that's niche, something that's perhaps in its pilot stages, to really starting to be embedded in the enterprise. And companies across industries are starting to act on it and deploy it and invest in it and bring it into their compliance, into their operations, into their brand, into their products. So I think it just really illustrates how quickly that has happened. And perhaps also at the same time, given we're talking here about risks, also perhaps shows that we're at an important moment where boards and executives are starting to think more about it's not just about opportunities, it's about the challenges associated with this now and how do we govern and have oversight of AI in a way that is effective and efficient and responsible. So very quick surge, Steve, and AI, I think just illustrates that AI, it's on the table now. It's table stakes. It's in every conversation, and this is now a material risk for many companies.
And so as you look across the Fortune 500, the S&P 500, there's a lot of different sectors represented. Do you see any trends across sectors?
We do. So when we break down data on S&P 500, we tend to slice into the 11 sectors that come under the GICS standard, right? So every public company is assigned to one of these 11 sectors. And the truth is, first of all sectors are disclosing on AI risk, I think, as you can imagine, given how many we just spoke about are now doing it. But this recent surge in disclosure is really concentrated in about 4 or 5 industries. And these are financials, healthcare, industrials, IT, so information technology, and consumer discretionary, right? So these are quite different kind of sectors. Obviously, a lot of different companies come under those 5, but we feel they perhaps the reason why is they maybe share 2 traits, right? One of which is high data intensity, and the second is direct human or regulatory exposure. So as AI is becoming embedded into its decisions, these risks around bias and reliability and privacy and oversight have become financially material. So it's a broad thing, but it is interesting how it's a handful of sectors that have really led this charge so far, at least from a risk disclosure perspective.
It's interesting because I can't imagine any company not having some sort of AI deployment, whether it's just simply a large language model or use of ChatGPT for enhanced search or a little bit of Gen AI. But we talked about the surge, but the flip side is you got 30% who are saying or not disclosing anything as a material risk. What does that say?
It's a really good point, right? That yeah, it's still, while 72% is a big number, there's still a significant number that aren't saying anything yet about AI risk. That's not to say they won't be soon. I think we attribute this to a few things, right? I think one, it might just be simply disclosures haven't caught up with practice yet. It'd be interesting to see what this number looks like next year. Some companies may also be still perhaps folding AI like implicitly into other disclosures, right? So perhaps they talk about cybersecurity, they don't quite foreground the AI angle yet, but maybe that's coming. But we do expect this number to continue to grow, Stephen. I think it will become just commonplace to acknowledge at least one, if not more, material AI risks in the years to come.
So if you think about your point was that there are people who are companies that are heavily tech oriented or heavily regulated are the ones that lean a little bit more to the disclosure side. So you can see that with the banks that are heavily regulated. And so therefore the disclosures are around trying to make sure that they don't get sued. They're following the laws on these things. And if your business is IT and or AI related, of course, your whole business model is predicated on it. What are the most common categories of AI risk that you see now that we've looked at the sectors?
we grouped every single AI risk disclosure into broad categories. These are broad categories that themselves have many subcategories, but we found three broad themes really dominated across the disclosures, and that was reputational risk, cybersecurity, and thirdly, legal and regulatory, and particularly regulatory. So these are broad categories, and we can maybe go into what comes under them and what doesn't come under them. But yeah, these are really where I guess companies' focus is trained, where they're really looking right now. Reputational risk in particular is the most common. We found about 40% of all S&P 500 firms disclose something relating to reputation this year. And that might encompass bias, it might encompass misinformation, might encompass privacy lapses, and so on. But other categories are very important too.
Now, what kind of regulatory risk did you see disclosed here? I guess regulatory risk is always an issue in any company that follows regulations. And if you read the risk factors in these reports, you always see factors related to whatever industry they're in that's tied to regulatory risk. Is a bunch of this just that there are new regulations, and so therefore companies feel obligated to do that? I'm trying to get to how much of this is just process oriented, regulatory oriented, and how much of this is that the world has changed and we really have a more risky situation because of it.
It's a really great question. I think on the one hand, you're right that there's always going to be an element of that there's always new regulations, right? There's always diverging regulations. There's always complexity and uncertainty around regulations. Thinking, for example, in the GNS Center at the Conference Board, we do a lot of work on ESG and sustainability disclosure regulations. And Steve, that is a huge sort of minefield and a rapidly evolving field. But I think when it comes to AI, I think there is something new as well. And actually, most of the risk disclosures that refer to regulations on AI typically refer to the challenges of uncertainty and the divergences between jurisdictions and how difficult it is for firms to plan their AI deployments amid diverging frameworks. And particularly the key divergence, particularly US firms and US multinationals, is between the EU, where you're seeing the EU AI Act starting to come in. It's really going to take force in the next couple of years. It has quite big obligations on companies, and the US, which is a very different sort of approach where there isn't really a sort of unified federal law, but there is state level regulations emerging, which is creating a kind of patchwork, and companies are struggling to navigate. So I think that's the really challenging thing about AI, that on the one hand, companies are in a rapid race to invest, to deploy, to integrate into their business, into their operations, into their products, but there's such uncertainty as to how to navigate these different regimes, and particularly I think the US EU divergence that is probably only going to continue to grow in the years to come.
Yeah, it's a good point. A lot of these companies in the S&P 500 are multinational, and therefore it's not just a US issue. And so you've got different countries regulating in different fashions, and yet a company needs to act pretty consistently across all of their operations. So that's a challenge. But even in the US, as you said, these multi-state regulatory schemes are very difficult for companies to navigate. And it feels like, these states should get together, or the federal government should step in and homogenize these rules.
You're so right, Steve. It's a real challenge where the EU effectively has created the world's sort of first big comprehensive binding AI law, and it has all these different aspects and risk tiered systems and all this sort of disclosure obligations. Whereas, yeah, the US is different. And I guess the federal government and the executive branch is very much emphasized innovation and infrastructure and global competitiveness and trying to have a light touch regulatory approach. But yet the states, it's very different, and different state laws. Some are very focused on specific issues, whether it's bias in employment or deep fake disclosure laws, but others are looking quite ambitious in their own right. I'm thinking particularly emerging regulatory frameworks in places like Colorado, California, Texas, very, very ambitious, and have different kind of approaches and different levels of emphasis. And it's going to be difficult for companies to stay ahead of all of this in the next few years in a way that still allows them to be nimble and agile and compete, right? And invest and deploy. So it's definitely, I think you can see that in the risk disclosures. As recently as a year or two ago, you didn't really see many disclosures about this. Now it's quickly emerging as a material issue. So I think it is definitely top of mind for boards and for C-suites.
We're talking about AI risk in companies and disclosure. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate the future of AI? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge from economics, marketing and communications, governance and sustainability, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Dr. Andrew Jones, Principal Researcher in the Governance and Sustainability Center at the Conference Board. Okay, Andrew, we're talking about your new paper, which our listeners can access on our website, tcb.org, and just click on the Governance and Sustainability Center, and they'll find your paper. It's a really interesting thing. Cybersecurity risks have been disclosed for a very long time. It's decades and decades as digital transformation has come into the companies since the 1970s. And I don't know, this sort of feels like just the next wave of digital transformation. AI is at its root. It's software, right? It does then introduce a whole nother layer of cybersecurity risk too.
It really does. And I think some of the cybersecurity risks being flagged up by companies are very interesting. And as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, cybersecurity risk was actually the second most disclosed category. About 20% of all S&P 500 firms, both this year and last year, said something about AI specifically, and not just talk about cybersecurity in broad terms, AI specifically and what it means for cybersecurity. And I think it's interesting. Actually, most of those disclosures talk in general terms about how AI is effectively just massively complicating the whole issue of cyber risk and cybersecurity, right? The AI itself is a force multiplier, right? That increases the scale, speed, and unpredictability of cyber attacks. I think hostile actors can use AI to really just create much more sophisticated attacks, find those sort of surfaces to get in. At the same time, also, the company's use of AI is itself inviting new kinds of challenges if hostile actors are able to, for example, inject prompts into their own system. So it's a real big concern, I think. And I think this is something that's going to be, we expect this to grow more in visibility, I think, as we see high profile incidents. And AI just really complicates what was already a very challenging area. So a very interesting field, Steve, and something we'll be keeping a close eye on.
The Conference Board just released its latest CEO Confidence Index for the fourth quarter, and we asked about AI and adoption, and we asked specifically of CEOs what their organization's primary driver was for AI investment. And it came back that the number one driver for investment in AI was to drive cost reduction and operational efficiency. Number two was new product and service innovation. Three was customer experience enhancement. So as you think about then risk disclosure, everything you've talked about follows that. The risks there's always the cybersecurity risk and people abusing AI tools, but the risk factors follow along these priorities for AI investment.
They do. It's a really good point. I think it does. And I think it shows how, as companies scale up investment in those priorities, it also just creates or enhances or intensifies the risks as well. And something we've heard a lot in our own engagements with chief legal officers, with heads of AI, with board directors, is how companies might benefit from differentiating between different types of AI and different types of uses from a risk perspective, right? So, for example, if you have a consumer-facing AI product, perhaps you put a bit more emphasis and a bit more controls on that from a risk management perspective than you do from a workforce-facing product, because obviously the reputational implications of a failing, misinforming customers, or perpetuating bias is enormous. And companies, I think, are waking up to how AI does both intensify certain risks that are already there, thinking, for example, cybersecurity, and also maybe fundamentally change or introduce new risks at the same time.
It's interesting. We talked about the cybersecurity and regulatory risk, but early on you mentioned reputational risks. What do you mean by that?
So we found this is the most frequently disclosed AI category, right? And the truth is it's a broad category. It encompasses a lot of stuff, right? But reputational risk, I think, just reflects how, when we talk about reputational risk, we're talking about how brand trust or stakeholder confidence can be impacted by AI performance. And we found a lot of things that came under the umbrella of reputation. Perhaps I'll just touch on a few that are the most disclosed. Interestingly, Steve, often when people think of reputational harm, they might think of privacy and data protection issues or generative AI creating hallucinations or perpetuating bias. And those are in there. And we find companies are disclosing more on those kinds of issues. But actually, the most commonly disclosed reputational AI risk related to the potential damage from over promising or failed AI deployments that do not meet expectations. So, in other words, the risk that AI might not deliver the promise that we hope it does. So, I think it's just really interesting how companies are looking at reputation and AI from a very much a multidimensional lens. They're thinking about reputation in terms of consumers and stakeholders, but they're also thinking about the reputational harm that may ensue if AI doesn't work out.
Well, and there's so many pieces that AI impacts. If you're talking about generative AI, this you mentioned hallucinations, but even beyond that, you have AI producing content or design or creating things. You don't know if they're violating somebody else's IP. You don't know whether this stuff is right or wrong. A lot of times, all of these things go to people trusting the products and services of a company, and so this is part and parcel of the reputational risk.
It's a really good point, yeah, and it's extremely difficult to keep up, right? It's difficult to keep up from a corporate perspective, from a risk management perspective, from a governance perspective, and I think it just illustrates how AI, yeah, as AI use is mainstreamed and it's incorporated into all sort of corners of the business and the enterprise, AI risk is also cutting into all corners of the enterprise too, and it's cutting across legal, financial, operational and ethical dimensions, right? And it just raises huge governance challenges. And I think that's perhaps the key to all of this, right? That if firms are going to harness the potential of AI while avoiding or mitigating these kind of potential risks, some of which have potentially huge material impacts, it will require very effective and very agile governance and oversight.
Another place that reputational risks creep in is in recruiting. And a lot of human resource departments have implemented AI tools in order to sort through the enormous volume of resumes and applications that people get for jobs. And so in other words, think about it as you just program the screening of this thing. And they're finding sometimes that these tools are screening out certain classes or certain types of people, maybe on demographic data and so forth, and can be discriminatory. So that's another place where reputational risk creeps in, and the need to have human beings really govern the implementation of AI.
Really important point, Steve. And I think people are waking up to the fact that AI can often, I guess it can perpetuate certain biases, or as you said, perhaps exclude certain groups, certain categories, particularly demographic categories, perhaps because the training data itself that's trained on has gaps in it or even the way it's processed. And that can then take on and perpetuate already existing disproportionate impacts and biases. So it's a really important point. And I guess these kind of issues, if they come to light or they lead to discriminatory outcomes, can be reputationally catastrophic. And it's worth pointing out that there is litigation emerging on, for example, the use of AI in workforce hiring practices. Companies need to be very careful here for sure.
And it cuts both ways because you also have the government clamping down on DEI related and quota related training and recruiting. And so therefore, either way, if it's a positive bias or negative bias, it can be risky as well. We're talking about disclosures in your report mostly. The concept of disclosures come out of a company's ERM, enterprise risk management planning, which usually sits with the audit committee, or sometimes there's a risk committee in financial services and other industries, but it's usually the audit committee. But that whole ERM process needs to be rethought in order to include all of these kinds of AI risks because the risk factor reporting comes out of that process.
Agreed. And we've done some interesting sort of early work in the Governance and Sustainability Center on where companies and specifically boards are starting to sit AI responsibility. And to your point, Steve, yeah, we're often finding the audit committee is where it is for the reasons you said, I think, the sort of the oversight of risk and the oversight of risk management. But clearly there is I think to your point, there is a huge need for evolution here to sort of refresh and even rethink some of the risk exposures of companies, and also think about how you govern all of that, right? And how you govern across functions as well. I think the more effective approaches here are those that really do bring in from across the company. I'm thinking obviously risk and compliance, technology, but also legal, communications, ESG. There needs to be a lot of voices here to ensure that AI risks, one, aren't going undetected, and two, are being managed and mitigated in an effective and agile way.
So just wrapping up here, as you look ahead, what are some areas of AI risk that you think will become more prominent and companies need to be thinking about just in case they have blind spots?
So it's a really great question. And I think you already mentioned one of these, Steve, which is around the workforce and labor relations and what the scaling and integration of AI might mean. We all know that sort of automation and AI can impact on employment patterns, can widen skill gaps, can lead to changes within workforce composition. And that does raise risks, right? And we didn't really find any companies really disclosing on these issues yet. But I think that labor and retraining costs and reputational elements could become material in the years ahead. And in addition to that, we'd also perhaps point out, I think, two other things, one of which is the environmental and sustainability dimensions here. No risk disclosures to talk about this, but we know training and running large AI models can consume a lot of energy, can consume a lot of water. AI's resource intensity might start attracting more investor attention in the years to come. And we might see, particularly perhaps like certain companies like the hyperscalers, the tech companies, the data center providers, maybe putting a bit more emphasis on that area. And one other thing I'd point to that I think is across the board and something that a lot of companies still need to grapple with is like the next generation of AI, right? Particularly agentic AI that is a lot more autonomous, has a lot less sort of human involvement. And I think the unpredictability and lack of clear human control could trigger a whole range of new liability and governance challenges. So there's a lot that companies should be keeping on their radar here.
Yeah, and if you look at the stock market today, we are in a bit of an AI bubble. It reminds me of 1999 and the dot-com era bubble where the market got frothy. And key risk here is that these AI companies or companies that have talked about implementation of AI or their business model revolves around it, there's risks that they're overpromising to their investors, and no line continues at a steep up. And so there are all sorts of market risks and valuation risks about and any loan and debt covenants that revolve around that. So lots of financial things that companies need to think about as well.
Really great point, Steve, and I completely agree, and I'd add as well that those market risks are also obviously intertwined with geopolitical risks as well. At the same time, we're seeing AI at the global level has almost become a sort of proxy for economic power, and the US, China, EU are all pursuing quite a different approach to AI, but obviously the end goal is clear, to sort of position as a leader in the space. So that sort of complicates all of the market and industry level risks as well. So it's a really fascinating area, and companies need to stay ahead and need to look ahead and need to be closely monitoring the environment.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Dr. Andrew Jones, thanks for being with us today.
Great to be with you, Steve. Always a pleasure.
Thanks to all of you for listening to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.